It's so good to be here and with you this morning, and always so fun for me getting abused today and last week, because for those of you who were here, Trevor was preaching on the first part of Colossians, and for whatever reason, he thought that he would bring up three men in the church, and he put up a beautiful picture of Evans in all of his glory, and then an even better picture of Doc Gunning, although I don't think there can be a bad picture. But what was amazing was that in this picture it looked like New York City out of the window, which was amazing. And then he brought up a picture of me, and you would have been forgiven for thinking that was a down and out. It wasn't the most flattering of pictures, but the joke is on him, because that is actually one of my best photos. I use it in all of my profile pics, and as you can tell, I'm no oil painting, but fortunately, God only cares about what is on the inside and not what's on the outside, which I think is a great segue into me starting my sermon, which is entitled The Great Rescue. So we're continuing in Colossians from where Trev left off. And just to give you a little bit of insight into Colossians, it was a letter written by Paul when he was under house arrest in Rome. And what had happened was in this church where Colossians was written, one of Paul's converts, Epaphras, had come to Paul and had told him about what was happening in his church. And so Paul writes this letter. Now, this letter comes with a couple of controversial pronunciations. So I just want to address it quickly. One is the town. So it has been pronounced Colossae, and Colossae. Now, the original Greek was spelled Kolossaai. So I'm going to be pronouncing it Colossae. I remember one of my professors saying, just choose a pronunciation and use it boldly, as though you actually know what you're talking about. So I'm going with Colossae. Now, at the same time, when Paul had written this letter, he'd also written a letter which we know as the Book of Philemon. Now, again, controversially, Pastor Darren pronounces it Philemon, which is just absurd. And I was in the States for university where I did a minor in Bible, and that's how they pronounce this book, Philemon. And I remember in class being asked what were my thoughts on Philemon. I had never ever heard of Philemon before. And so I asked if it was one of the books from the Apocrypha in the Catholic Bible. Well, needless to say, I wasn't asked many questions after that. So all of that to say is that I'm pronouncing it Colossae. And that is the town where this church is located and where okay. So as you can see in the map, Colossae is in modern-day Turkey. And in the far left is Rome, which is where Paul was when he wrote this letter. Now, a few hundred years before Paul wrote this letter, Colossae was a massive trading town. And what had happened was that the Mediterranean Sea, which is the Middle Sea in the map over there, The northern part of the Mediterranean Sea is the Aegean Sea. And Darius I had built this massive road, which was the Great Persian Royal Road, which basically ran from the Aegean Sea all the way through modern Turkey and all the way through to Iran, to modern-day Iran. And it was about 3,000 kilometers long. And it meant that travel, which could take up to 3 months to travel that distance, turned into just 10 days. And so you had this massive road and huge trade running along there. And so Colossae had become a huge trading hub. Now, when Paul writes this, what had happened was that now, with Ephesus being right on the Aegean Sea and with a couple of other larger towns expanding and coming up, like Laodicea, and that Colossae had become smaller. And so when Paul is there, he actually never visits Colossae. He spends 3 months in Ephesus, and it's where that he plants his church. And then he makes this convert, a number of converts, but this one particular convert in Epaphras. And Epaphras is from that town. And so he's in Ephesus when he becomes a convert. And then he goes back to his hometown, and he starts that church of Colossae. And so when Paul is in Rome under house arrest, Epaphras goes all the way to Rome to see Paul and to tell him that what has happened in his church is that there has been this thing of heresy where people within the church are going against the supremacy of Christ and exactly what that means. And so after doing that and after speaking to Paul and updating him on exactly what is happening in the church, Paul writes this message. Now, last week is when Trev started us off on Colossians, and I am going to carry on from where Trev left off, which is Colossians chapter 1, verses 9 to 14. So if you have your Bible, please would you open it up with me, or you can read from the screen. Verse 9. For this reason we also, since the day we heard about it, have not ceased praying for you and asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so that you will walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, to please him in all respects, bearing fruit in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God, strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, for the attaining of all perseverance and patience joyously, giving thanks to the Father, who has qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. For he rescued us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. If I could break down this passage into one sentence, it would be this: that we are to live lives worthy of the Lord only by his strength, because he rescued us from darkness. And for this morning's sermon, I split it up into 3 points. The first is that we are to live lives worthy of the Lord. The second is that it is only by his strength that we can live those lives. And the third and final point is that it's because he rescued us from darkness. Please would you bow your heads and pray with me. Father, thank you for this time that we have to go through your word, to go through your scriptures. Thank you for your gospel. Thank you for the good news that you've brought to us. And I pray that this morning you would use me as your vessel, that your words would be heard, that your message would be delivered, that I would become nothing, that you would become everything, and that all the focus would be on you, and that you would get all the glory this morning. In your name I pray. Amen. And so we go to the first point. And the first point comes from verses 9 to 10. For this reason, we also, since the day we heard about it, have not ceased praying for you and asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so that you will walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, to please him in all respects, bearing fruit in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God. As we saw from the first 8 verses of Colossians, Paul spoke about the love and the faith within the Colossian church. And he goes on to say here, since we heard about you from Epaphras, we have not stopped praying for you. And he goes on to talk about what he's praying for. And that is that they will be filled with the knowledge of his will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding. Now, what's so striking to me about this is not necessarily what he's praying for, but what he doesn't pray for. In this, knowing exactly what's happened, exactly what Epaphras has told them, he's not praying for easier lives for them. He's not praying for influence or prestige for the church. He's not even praying for their ministry. None of that is what he talks about. Instead, he prays that they would be filled with the knowledge of God, so that they might live lives worthy of the Lord. And this, I think, is so important for us to understand, that one of God's great concerns for us is our transformation. And that can happen through knowledge. Paul uses the word epignosis here, and it's the idea of a full and complete and accurate knowledge of the truth. And as Paul describes it, it has 2 qualities, wisdom and understanding, because knowledge doesn't always translate into wisdom and understanding, even knowledge of the scriptures. I was very blessed to be at a Christian university in the States. And so many amazing pastors and missionaries have come through that university. And in large part, it's because of the knowledge bestowed upon them by this university. But on the other hand, there were also a lot of students who came from Christian homes, even pastors' homes, who had that exact same knowledge bestowed upon them. And yet that did not translate into wisdom and understanding. In fact, it can translate into arrogance and judgment. And that's why it's so important that we understand that Paul is not just championing information. He's not just championing knowledge, but he is championing transformation through knowledge. And I love this quote about transformation. It was attributed to an unknown monk in the 12th century. When I was a young man, I wanted to change the world. I found it was difficult to change the world, so I tried to change my nation. When I found I couldn't change the nation, I began to focus on my town. I couldn't change the town, and as an older man, I tried to change my family. Now, as an old man, I realized the only thing I can change is myself. And suddenly, I realized that if long ago I had changed myself, I could have made an impact on my family. My family and I could have made an impact on our town. Their impact could have changed the nation, and I could indeed have changed the world. Paul goes on to say in our passage that having a knowledge so that we can walk in a manner worthy of the Lord. Now that might seem incredibly weighty, because after all, who can walk in a manner worthy of a God who is holy, righteous, and perfect? Surely if Paul is calling us to perfection and calling that the standard, then none of us would stand. Rather, Paul is speaking about a life that is fitting for someone who belongs to Christ, a life that reflects the one we follow. It's a life that declares through our actions, priorities, and our choices that Jesus is worthy of our allegiance. This truth is seen so powerfully in the life of William Whiting Borden. William was born into extraordinary wealth in Chicago in the late 1800s. His father was a multimillionaire making all his money through the mining industry. And he tapped William as the one who would take over that business. William had everything. He had all of this wealth. He had all of the comforts that he could ever want. He was also incredibly bright. He was very athletic as well. And everything that he touched turned to gold. He was successful in everything that he tried. He went to Yale and then did a trip around the world. And it was at this time when he realized and felt as though God were talking to him and telling him that there were so many unsaved people out there that he would be a missionary. And he felt called to China, to the Gansu province, which is where a lot of Muslims were living. And what he had written in the back of his Bible was just 2 words, and it was no reserves. And what he meant by that was that everything that he had was never ever going to be kept from God. Everything that he had was going to be used for God's service. No reserves. And everything that he wanted to do, the only thing that he wanted to do, was to get to China to preach the gospel to this Muslim population in the Gansu province. His father had said to him, had really wanted him to take over the business, and so had given him everything that he could have wanted. When that wasn't working, he decided to put away the carrot and take out the stick, and basically said to him, if you don't stop what you're doing, stop these ridiculous plans and take over the business, then you're going to have nothing. All of your inheritance will be taken away and you will have nothing. William wrote in the back of his Bible, just under those first 2 words, no retreat. He wasn't going to turn back. He knew that God wanted him to go to China, and that's what he was going to do. But in order to go and preach to the Muslims, he realized he needed to know Arabic. He needed to understand Islam as well and to study the Quran. And so he went to Cairo in Egypt. And within a few weeks of being in Cairo, he picked up bacterial meningitis. And within a few days, he passed away. All of his belongings were sent back to his parents, including his Bible. And at the back of his Bible, they read what he had written: no reserves, no retreat, and then 2 more words underneath: no regrets. Now, hearing William's story might leave us asking, how can anyone actually live like that? And Paul answers that in verse 11. Strengthened with all power, according to God's glorious might, for the attaining of all perseverance and patience joyously. And so my second point this morning is that it is only by his strength that we can live those worthy lives. As believers, knowing that Paul is indirectly talking to us, don't you just love the words that he uses here? All power, all of God's power, and his glorious might. How amazing it is that we can share in that. And it makes it even more encouraging, knowing that for a lot of us, in fact, for all of us, we go through such trying times. The Christian life is not easy. It requires perseverance. It requires patience. It requires a strength beyond what we naturally possess. I know that many of us here are excited about our faith, inspired by the scriptures, and determined to live well for Christ. But life this side of heaven is tough. Trials come and temptations persist. Discouragement creeps in, and we know all too well that intentions are not enough. Paul understands that, and that's why he doesn't say to us, well, just dig deeper, just try harder. Instead, he understands that we need a strength that comes entirely out of ourselves, strengthened with all power according to God's glorious might. And a perfect illustration for this is the branches and the vine in the vineyard. And I know this with first-hand knowledge, and so I have to just tell you a story of how I know this. It was one of my summer vacations, and my best friend from college, Jeremiah, he would always in the summer go to this vineyard that was quite close to where he lived in Pennsylvania, quite close to Philadelphia. And he said, oh, no, there's good money here, but it is hard work. And I thought, well, I'm not allergic to hard work, so I can give it a go. and the money sounded good. So I was quite excited about it, and so I went. And within the first day, under this oppressive heat and incredibly harsh conditions, I realized that I was actually allergic to hard work. I hated every second of it. But it was quite good money. And Jeremiah also said, well, this would also be a good time to get a tan, because, we were kind of coming out of winter, and, we were as white as we could be. And so we thought, well, actually, this would be a good idea to try and get a tan. So after a week of just terrible, terrible work, we then came back quite excited, because now not only were we working for money, but we were also going to get a tan. And we didn't want to get sunburnt, So anyway, we were now working in the vineyard, and we had our shirts off and our shorts rolled up and started putting on sun cream. But then we realized that, already it wasn't that great that there was two young guys without shirts and shorts rolled up. But now if there was two young guys with no shirts and shorts rolled up putting sun cream on each other, then that you couldn't look anyone in the eyes if anyone saw that. So Jeremiah started, and he, as quickly as possible, put on my back. And he quickly handed it over to me. And I quickly started. But then I heard a noise. And I looked. And what I'd failed to mention was that this vineyard was owned by Slovaks. And I'd never come across Slovaks before. But Slovaks, at least in my experience, are incredibly masculine men with, full-grown beards. Not like this, like proper full-grown beards. And they couldn't speak English, but I could always tell in their eyes exactly, what they thought of me. So I start, and then I hear this noise, and I look, and it's the most muscular and the guy with the biggest beard. He was looking at us from down one of the aisles of the vineyard, and I stopped and I looked at him, and we just stared at each other for what seemed like an eternity. And then he just slowly shook his head and he moved off. So that was incredibly embarrassing. And after a very long and embarrassing day, we went home. And in the car, Jay said to me, my back is incredibly sore. Do you mind just having a look? And when I looked, his back was bright pink, because I had applied sun cream to the top, but then obviously I'd been distracted, and so chucked that bottle and then didn't finish off the job. So he was, probably like medically scarred from this burn, because it was that bad. Obviously I said, no, it looks fine. And what I learned from that is three things. The first is how important sun cream actually is. The second is that you need good friends in this life, and Jay needed to find better ones. And the third, and this is to come back to the sermon, is how much care vineyard workers gave to the vines themselves. Because what would happen, and what one of my jobs was to go around and to make sure that all of the branches were up and connected to the vines. And I thought it was a waste, because even branches that looked quite good, they still had leaves and everything, I still had to go and kind of connect them to the trellis and make sure that they were still upright and connected to the vine. But that is the most important thing for these branches, because they had to be connected to their life source. If they weren't connected to their life source, they would die. And even if they looked healthy, even if they looked fine, if they weren't connected to the life source, they would die. Their decline was inevitable. Strength was never found in the branch itself. Strength came from outside the branch. That strength came from the vine. And only those branches that were connected to the vine actually grew and flourished. In John 15:5-8, Jesus says this, "I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him, he bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away as a branch and dries up, and they gather them and cast them into the fire, and they burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. And so this leads me to my third and final point. This is on. Okay. My third and final point is it's because he rescued us from darkness. To the question of why are we to live lives worthy of the Lord? And why through his strength? The answer is because he rescued us from darkness. And so we go back to the passage. Verse 12, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. For he rescued us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. These are some of the most hopeful words in all of Scripture because they completely overturn the way that many think about Christianity. So often we think and can be thought of as and imagine Christianity as a system of moral effort, as though the message is simply try harder, be better, clean yourself up, and then perhaps God will accept you. But Paul presents something entirely different. He does not say that we qualified ourselves. In fact, as you can see from this passage, he says the exact opposite. He says that the Father qualified us. He does not say that we found ourselves. We found a way outside of darkness. He says that the Father rescued us. And again, just look at those beautiful words that he uses. Saints of light, kingdom of his beloved Son, and redemption. Paul's words are such a beautiful and compelling picture of the gospel. And when I first started reading this passage, one of the first things that came to my mind was an event that had happened in 2010. Some of you will remember it, where back in 2010 there was the story of the Chilean miners, where that mine in Chile, in San Jose, Chile, had collapsed. 700 meters down in the ground, this mine had collapsed, and 33 miners were trapped in this chamber. And just imagine the experience of being 700 meters below ground. This thing collapses, and you are trapped in darkness, the noise, the dust, the realization that the exit was gone, and there was probably no chance of you being saved. They were cut off from the world, had limited food, and fear and uncertainty were pressing in on them. Day after day, the families and those rescue workers tried to get deeper and deeper, not having any idea whether these miners were even alive or not. And after 17 agonizing days of constantly, 24 hours a day, trying to get down to these miners, they managed to drill in through that chamber. And then there was this, what became a famous piece of paper that was lifted up to them. And on this piece of paper, it said, "We are well in the shelter, the 33." And that gave the rescuers hope that these guys were alive and that they could get to them. And the whole world watched as the rescue effort intensified. And eventually, one by one, each miner was lifted up in a small capsule, just big enough for one person, up through the drilled hole and lifted up to the surface from this dark, this dusty chamber, this domain of darkness. They were lifted up into this light, greeted by cheering crowds, their weeping family members, and overwhelming relief. Can you imagine how grateful those miners were to their rescuers? One of the tragedies in our Christian life is that over time we can begin to act as though our salvation, our redemption, was a small favor rather than a miraculous rescue. We become familiar with grace. We lose our wonder, and we shift from gratitude to entitlement. But passages like this I love because they bring us back to astonishment. Remember where you were. Remember when you were in that darkness. And remember the helplessness that you felt. Remember that Christ came for you when you could not do it yourself. And if you truly understand that, it changes everything. Because gratitude replaces pride. Because you know you did not qualify yourself. Humility replaces self-righteousness. Because you know that your forgiveness was purchased and not earned. Joy replaces fear. Because you know you have been transferred into Christ's kingdom. The gospel is not the story of people climbing their way to God. It's the story of God descending to rescue us, people who could never save ourselves. The Chilean miners emerged into the light because the rescuers came down to them and saved them, not because the miners were able to find a way to get to the rescuers. We stand in the light of grace because Christ came for us. And if there's only one thing that you can remember from my entire sermon, it's this: that people who know they were rescued never stop being grateful to the rescuer. And so to conclude, Paul's message to the Colossian church 2,000 years ago is the same message for us this morning. We are to live lives worthy of the Lord by His strength because He rescued us. But so often as Christians, we can get the order wrong. We can make the focus more on trying to live those lives, more on trying to clean ourselves up by ourselves, and doing that rather than remembering exactly who it is that came and who it is that saved us. We do not live worthy lives in order to be rescued. We live worthy lives because we were rescued. We were sinners trapped in darkness, unable to save ourselves, and God in His mercy came for us. And that is the most important truth that we can know, and the most important truth that we can preach. It's only through Christ that we are saved, and it is only through Christ that we have the strength to persevere, to be patient, and to endure with joy. And it is only then, as people who have been rescued and who remain connected to Him, that we can bear fruit and live lives that are worthy of the one who saved us. And like William Borden, when we truly understand that, we too can live with no reserves, no retreats, and no regrets.